All right, so this is going to be part 2 of chapter 5. Again, make sure you're reading your textbook to get the full material, but I do want to go through some examples and some explanations of different things we can find within our ecosystems. So to start off with, I want you to have an understanding of an ecological niche, and basically this is the place that an organism has within the environment. So is it a predator organism? Is it a prey organism? Where does it live? How does it reproduce? Where does it have its nesting sites? So any, role that it plays within the environment is considered its niche. Now, we can put organisms into two general categories. We can say whether they're generalists or specialists. Now, a generalist has the capability to live in multiple places, reproduce in multiple places, eat a lot of different types of foods, whereas a specialist can only live in few places or reproduce in few places or eat just one or two different types of food. So generalists are very good at survival, whereas specialists, they're really under threat because if anything happens to their food source or their home site, anything happens to that, then they can't survive. So these tend to be organisms that are really susceptible to becoming endangered or going extinct. So we can call, their niche, we could say that whether it's narrow or whether it's broad, basically just saying how much of the resource or how many different resources do they use. So, an example here is going to be the panda versus the raccoon. And if you're going to be a generalist, you're going to have a very broad niche and you're going to be able to use a lot of resources, live a lot of different places, and we could definitely see that with raccoons. They can live in the forest, they can live in the fields, they live in our backyards. They will eat garbage, they will, eat crayfish from a stream, they will eat seeds, they will eat fruits, they'll scavenge for things. They are very, adaptable to different situations, and for that reason they're a generalist and have what we consider to be a broad niche. Here's an example of a specialist, not so much in the type of food that it eats, but here as a reproductive mechanism. So this is the Kirtland warbler, and this is a warbler we have here in Michigan, and they breed here in Michigan and nowhere else. So up north there are some forests that they like to breed in, and if anything were to happen to those forests, most likely these wouldn't survive because that is their breeding ground. They don't go anywhere else. They overwinter down south and they come back up and then they breed in Michigan. They are a specialist species. This is the Karner blue butterfly, and they're a specialist in that they will only lay their eggs, and their larvae will only feed on the lupin, which is that flower on the right here that's found in prairies. We've destroyed a lot of our prairies and turned them into farmlands. We don't see quite as much lupin any longer, and for that reason the Karner blue butterfly has been, under threat of becoming endangered or going extinct. Now, organisms have lots of interactions with one another. One type of interaction that they can have is competition, and that's not an ideal situation because when resources are limited, for example, a food source, a water source, a nesting site, those are all different kinds of resources. When there's not enough to go around, species either have to learn to become more efficient and use a different part of that resource, or they fight. Fighting is never beneficial within species because, an organism can get hurt, and that's going to, leave them susceptible to disease and predation. They can become weaker. They're expending energy that would be better spent, foraging for food or finding mates. So this fighting, and competition that's direct with one another is not beneficial to any of the organisms. Sometimes we find one species can exploit more of the resources and actually drive another species out of a certain area because their population in that area will die off because they're not getting the resources that they need. Now, in reality, we have what's known as the competitive exclusion principle, and this just means that no two species can occupy the same niche for very long. One will always end up outcompeting the other. Now, we do see organisms living together. We have these big communities. We have birds that eat seeds. We have birds that nest in the trees. And in some cases, it's like competition with one another. But what we've seen more than anything is a process known as resource partitioning. And this is where species will use the same resource but use it in a different way. So we'll go through some examples of this. So here what we have is we've got these two different anoles in Florida, the green anole and the brown anole. And where their habitat or their niche really is going to interact with one another, one will outcompete the other one. In this case, the brown anole outcompeted the green anole. So this gives us two different, definitions. Your fundamental niche is the potential idealized niche. The green anole would have been able to live or eat these, certain foods and live in these different areas if it weren't for the brown anole. But because the brown anole is there, the green anole actually has what's known as a realized niche, the actual niche of the organism, because, it just got outcompeted, so it can't live or eat that certain type of food. Now with resource partitioning, what we could see, here's an example of different warbler species. They all want to use the same type of pine tree to build their nests. So if they all want to nest in the same tree, in the same spot, they're going to be fighting. They're going to be competing with one another. And again, that's not beneficial. So a way to reduce that competition for resources, we could see that, the birds will use different parts of the tree. Some will use just the bottom, sometimes it's just the top, some on the inner branches, some on the outer branches. And this will reduce their interaction with one another for competing for nest sites. Less competition, less, energy spent, less harm that could be done to them. So resource partitioning, is a good way to split up a resource. Here our resource is going to be your shoreline. All of these birds want to eat along the shoreline, so they will split it up. So some birds are specialized, like the flamingo, to wade in deeper water and be able to, dig in the mud. We've got, some of the birds that are along the shoreline that, have long beaks to, go into the sand and go around for, worms and little crustaceans and little insects. So they are able to now use different parts of this same resource, which is the shoreline, just by using different, whether it's the sand or whether it's the water, and they all have specialized parts that allow them to do that a little bit easier. Here's another example. On the left, we have the great horned owl, and on the right, we have the red-tailed hawk. So with these two different species, they both want to eat rodents. So they resource partition by time of day, with the owl hunting at night and the hawk hunting during the day. This means that, they will reduce their interaction with one another. They won't fight to compete over different, food sources. They would just use it at different times of the day. Less direct competition this way, which is beneficial to both. Now, we'll come back and talk more about this process when we get into natural selection and evolution, because it's not like any of these organisms, the shorebirds or the birds in the trees or, the owl and the hawk got together and said, all right, here's the deal. You hunt during the day, I'll hunt during night, or I'm going to use this part of it. This all happened through natural selection, in that whoever had less competition tended to survive better. And if they survived better, they passed on those traits. So the owls, with the tendency to hunt during the night and have those, adaptations like the large eyes to help them hunt during the night, they survived better, they reproduced, they passed those traits on to the next generation, ultimately, resulting in these partitioning of those resources. And we'll come back and talk about that in Chapter 6. Now, there are other types of interactions other than competition for resources. So a lot of times we can find, a symbiotic relationship, which just means that two species live in close association with one another. And we'll look at some of these examples. Now, this is the result of coevolution. Two organisms undergoing natural selection and evolution together, resulting in these very close relationships. And again, we'll come back and talk more about the process of coevolution in Chapter 6. There are three main types of these symbiotic relationships that we'll talk about: mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. So, and you can see in the chart on the upper right there, mutualism, commensalism, parasitism, all three organisms will benefit, but it's the second organism that they're interacting with could either benefit, be not affected at all, or could be harmed. And we'll go through those examples. So let's start off with parasitism. This is probably the one that you're most familiar with more than anything. A parasite being something that lives on a host or in a host. Typically your parasite's smaller than the host organism, the one that it's feeding off of or living on. But the parasite benefits from this relationship and the host is harmed. The parasite will rarely kill the host, because if you think about if the parasite is relying on that host for survival, what benefit does it gain from killing the host? It doesn't gain anything. When a parasite does kill the host, we typically refer to those as parasitoids because they are similar to parasites, but a parasite typically isn't going to kill its host. We'll talk about a few of those examples too. So here's an example of a parasite. This is a sea lamprey. The lamprey is attached to the fish there, and it looks like a big leech. And, well, quite frankly, the sea lamprey kind of acts like a leech. It feeds off of the blood of living fish. Now, both of these are alive. The lamprey comes up, and it has like these rasping mouth parts that it will use to suction onto and then dig through the skin and the flesh of the fish. And then it will feed off of the fish living on it. Now, one sea lamprey typically isn't going to kill a fish, but it has multiple sea lamprey. It could weaken enough to the point that it can kill it. But anything that it's doing, if you have a parasite that is that large in comparison to your body size, it's going to be taking a lot of your energy. So it takes your blood. Now you've got to use your energy to replace that lost blood. And it's going to be harming the fish. This has been a really big problem. The sea lamprey is an invasive species, which we'll come back and talk more about also. But it's an invasive species, and it's really harming our fish populations. The sea lamprey benefits, the fish gets harmed. There's a lot of other parasitic relationships. The bottom right there is a leech. The leech feeds on blood. Again, it's not going to kill a person, but if we have a leech on us, we have to now replenish those lost nutrients in that blood. So it is harming us in some way. The ticks, of course, they can give different types of diseases, but also a tick steals blood, and that is something we have to replenish. Heartworm there, that's a really heavily infested heart. It has a lot of heartworm. It's something that infects dogs. It can also infect cats. They haven't had a recorded case of heartworm affecting people. A lot of these parasites are very species specific or host specific. Leeches, for example, some will only feed off mammals, others will only feed off turtles. So some are very specific to who they actually go after. But heartworm, again, transmitted by a mosquito, and then it feeds off the blood or the nutrition of a dog, and therefore it harms the dog. And obviously, if you get a lot of parasites, like in this example here, those are lots and lots of worms, you can really cause a lot of harm. One parasite, the goal really isn't to kill your host, it's to just survive in your host, whereas sometimes they get such a heavy parasite load that it can be very, very dangerous. Mutualism is something that's beneficial for both species. So you can have, nutrition or protection, a relationship where both benefit. The gut inhabitant mutualism, that's an example with us. We have bacteria that live in our large intestine. We give that bacteria a nice place to live and give them plenty of food, and in return they help us break down things like fiber and also produce vitamin K for us, which is good for blood clotting. So mutualistic relationship, it's good for both. So now again, this isn't cooperation. This isn't, where we got together with our bacteria and said, all right, here's the deal. You can live here, and I'll give you food food and you give me vitamin K and we're all set. It's mutual exploitation. We're using the bacteria is using us. One of the most classic examples of mutualism are the ants in the acacia tree. So the acacia tree, you could see, is this tree that has these really large thorns. Now the thorns do help to defend against predators, but they're also big and hollow, and the ants can live inside of those thorns. Now another thing that we find within the acacia tree are these little nectaries. So that's that middle picture there where the ant is feeding off a nectary. Now, most plants produce nectar with their flower to help them with reproductive purposes, whereas here this is found at the base of their leaves, not anywhere close to their reproductive surfaces. So this is not about pollination and attracting pollinators, but instead it is really about feeding the ant. So the acacia tree has evolved to have these nectaries and these big thorns, and the ants will live there, so the ants definitely get a benefit out of this. And in return, the acacia tree gets their own living security system. If any herbivores come along and they try to eat the acacia tree, the ants will defend their home. They will come out in swarms and bite whatever is coming after them and basically chase off, any type of herbivore from eating the acacia tree. They both get benefit from this relationship, which makes it mutualism. Pollinators, also mutualistic relationship. The pollinator here, for example, the hummingbird, gets to drink nectar, and in return the plant or the flower here is going to be able to drop its pollen off, and when the hummingbird goes to another flower, it will bring the pollen with it and allowing this plant to be able to reproduce. Mutualistic, it's beneficial for both. You could see mutualistic relationships with different feeding organisms. So here, these birds have a place to perch. It's protection from predators. They can eat the parasites off the rhinoceros, and in return the rhinoceros is going to have its parasites eaten, and it doesn't have to worry about having those parasites. Beneficial for both. Now, the last type of symbiotic relationship here is commensalism. Now, commensalism is where, beneficial for one species and the other one, doesn't really care either way. Commensalism is debated. Some people will say every form of commensalism is either mutualism or parasitism. But the idea of commensalism is that one species doesn't get, helped nor harmed by this. Epiphytes are going to be plants that grow kind of in the crooks of trees. And the idea there being that the plant that's growing in the V of the tree is it's not going to, take up a lot of space. And it's going to be protected by herbivores if it's growing high up in a tree, so that the plant gets the benefit where the tree really isn't harmed. It has a small little plant growing on it and really doesn't affect it at all. Birds nesting in the trees, same thing. The birds get a benefit from being able to nest in the tree, and the tree doesn't get harmed in the process, not in any major way. But for people that argue against commensalism, they could say the epiphytes, those are going to steal some of the water from the tree, or by keeping water, producing soil in the crook of a tree, that it's going to produce rotting or disease for the tree and in some way harming it, therefore being a form of parasitism. And the birds nesting in the trees, by landing in the branches all the time and moving things around, they can break some of the branches in some small way, harm those trees. But again, it's such a small difference that we consider these things to be commensalism because so little harm is being done, if any harm at all. Here's a picture of a plant growing along a tree. Another example of commensalism would be barnacles. So these little spots on the tail of a whale, those are barnacles, those are animals that live right on there. And the whale is so big that these little organisms just living on the whale aren't going to harm it at all. It benefits the barnacles by giving them a place to live and doesn't harm the whale. But again, in some small way we could argue that, it puts drag on the whale and so it has to expend more energy to swim through the water. Yeah, really, really tiny amount of energy. But in some small way, some people would argue that this is, some form of parasitism. We really consider it commensalism though. So other interactions that organisms can have are, of course, competition. Again, competition is not something that we want to see, but if it does occur between members of the same species, it's intraspecific competition. Members of the same species fighting over a food source, for example, or like the picture on the right with the deer. That are fighting over the reproductive rights with a female. Those are intraspecific. Interspecific competition can be like what we see in the top picture there with the lion and the hyenas. Two different species competing over the same resource. So if the lion makes a kill, the hyenas might want to come in and steal that kill from them, causing direct competition. Again, not an ideal situation to be able to, have this kind of interaction. Another type of interaction between organisms are predator-prey interactions. Predation is the consumption of one species by another species, predator and prey. So there's always that, issue of being able to be faster than your predator, or be able to catch your prey. And we consider this to be a co-evolutionary arms race. The faster the prey animal is, and the faster the predator gets to be able to catch it, and on and on and on. And we can come back to the evolution side of things and call this a Red Queen hypothesis, which comes back to the Alice in Wonderland concept, where Alice is running away from the Queen of Hearts, and she says, gosh, no matter how fast I run, I just can't seem to get ahead. And this is the idea that the faster a predator or prey animal becomes, the faster a predator becomes, or the better camouflage, prey animal has, the better eyesight a predator animal has. So, with all of those kinds of things, you feel like all these organisms are constantly evolving, but they evolve together, getting this evolutionary arms race. Now, predators have different mechanisms in which they can capture their prey. They can capture it, of course, by movement, whether walking or swimming or flying or pursuit, or and then also things like camouflage or chemical warfare. So let's take a look at a few of these examples of how predators have these adaptations, these advantages to be able to capture their prey. Now, you might not think of walking as being a primary way to capture your prey, but if you're one organism eating another organism that's not moving, like a deer eating a, plant, well, the plant's not moving, so the deer can walk right up and eat it. Predator-prey interaction. Not our classic predator-prey where you think about, a snake and a mouse or a hawk and a snake, but still one organism eating another. We could see organisms swimming to capture their prey. So whether their prey are fish, like it's on the right-hand side there, where they've got to be fast and capture those fish, or whether it's like a whale that's a filter feeder that takes water in with all the plankton and microorganisms and then filters that food out from the water. Swimming is the way that they can capture their food. Flying is a mechanism used by different things. Some birds will catch their prey mid-flight. Bats will also go hunting, and mid-flight they'll catch the moths and the mosquitoes and different flying organisms. So sometimes flying is the mechanism predators will use. Sometimes you'll have the predator hide and then wait for its prey to come along, and you have pursuit and ambush. Here's a bear with a fish, another example of that pursuit and ambush where they go in and they, capture the fish. Camouflage can be used. People use camouflage when they're hunting, predator-prey interaction. We've got a praying mantis there, so it blends in very well with its surrounding, waiting for prey, and then it can reach out and grab them. We have the snowy owl there at the bottom, and the snowy owl again blends in with its surroundings so its prey can't see it. So if you're going to be, ambushing your prey or waiting for them, if you blend in with your surroundings, it really can help out with that process. Some predators use chemicals. So the top left there, that's the Massasauga, which is our rattlesnake we have in Michigan, the eastern Massasauga. And they use chemicals. They use venom to get their prey. So when they bite their prey, it's going to, paralyze their prey and start breaking down their tissues for them so that when they swallow it, they're easier to swallow, it's less dangerous for them, and they break them down a little easier. The spider on the left bottom there, that is a wolf spider, and again, they are going to use their venom to help them paralyze and break down their prey. So these chemical mechanisms help out quite a bit with, the predators being able to get whatever it is that they're after. The picture on the right there, those are cicada killer wasps, and that's a type of wasp. We also have those in Michigan. You may have never seen them before because they're not an aggressive species towards people. They also don't form large hives. You can see, a population of these living kind of close together, but they don't form those big hives like what you see with things like bald-faced hornets and paper wasps and yellow jackets or honeybees. So instead, these, live kind of by themselves. And they also will use their venom. What they do with their venom is they kill cicadas, and then they can bring those cicadas and be able to feed their young with them. Now, prey species don't want to be eaten, obviously, so there's ways that they have evolved to avoid capture. So those things can, involve movement. They can run away, swim away, fly away from their predators. But let's also look at a few other examples, things like, having a physical protection or camouflage or chemicals or coloration, and sometimes even deceptive looks and behavior. So let's take a look at a few of these examples. So these are going to be pretty obvious here. Physical protection, something like a porcupine. You go up and you try to get a bite out of a porcupine, you're going to get, quills in you. And those are barbed. They don't come out very easily, and it, works really effectively. So the predators tend to stay away from things like porcupines. Plants having thorns or even hair that covers them, this hairy extensions called trichomes. Those kinds of things are protection. This plant on the right is stinging nettle, so it actually goes above and beyond. On top of just having, these physical components, it also has a chemical component. Stinging nettle, when you rub up against it, so if you're walking and your hand even just brushes or your leg brushes against stinging nettle, it stings and it burns, and it's extremely uncomfortable. We do have that in Michigan. You tend to find it growing in wetter areas like along streams. So stinging nettle is a pretty nasty plant. So even if you just brush against it and come in contact with it, and it hurts and it stings, you definitely don't want a mouthful of that. And predators or herbivores, they learn very quickly to stay away from it. Being physically tough. Turtles having shells, or the oak tree, these oak leaves have tannins in them that are tough to break down, tough to digest. They're very resilient plants, and those things will help with protection. Camouflage, very basic. If you can't see me, you can't eat me. So camouflage is just hiding from your predators. Sometimes the camouflage is going to involve just, blending in with your background. Sometimes camouflage will involve things like looking like leaves or sticks to help defend you. Chemical means of defense can come in different forms. That plant on the left is milkweed. When you break it open, you get that picture on the bottom left. Its sap is this milky white color, and it's toxic. It's fine for you to touch and everything like that, but you shouldn't eat it. Animals that eat it get really sick. There are some animals that have co-evolved with milkweed, really creative names like the milkweed bug, and the milkweed beetle that can eat the milkweed plant and survive off of it, and they actually become toxic to other animals because now that toxin becomes part of their body. The monarch butterfly, their caterpillar only eats milkweed, so the monarch butterfly caterpillar becomes toxic for other animals to eat, as well as the adult monarch butterfly. Wasps, those have a chemical mean of defense as well. They've got that sting, and that sting is going to help them to be able to defend themselves. And if you've been the unfortunate side effect of having a wasp sting, you know that they can really hurt. And a lot of times that's just an unfortunate side effect. Most of the time people aren't going after those, wasp nests, trying to, eat them or anything else. But things like birds and raccoons love to go after the wasp nests because they have, all of those tasty little larvae in there and pupae, which are really good protein sources. So the wasp needs a way to protect itself. Now, the bottom right there, we have a skunk. Very obvious, very direct. Chemical means of defense. If you smell really bad, you're not going to get eaten. And it's been very effective for the skunk. Now, another means of defense is warning coloration, and this is tied in with an organism being dangerous, whether it's a venomous, like the coral snake, venomous like a wasp, or, toxic, like the monarch butterfly. If an animal, comes close, it can be bit and killed, it could be stung and hurt or killed, or it can be, get really sick from eating something like the butterfly there. So it has these bright colorations, not because it's trying to hide, it has bright colorations to say, I know you see me, I am right here, but you've seen me before, you've seen these colors, it's orange and black, yellow and black, or red and black, and you know that I'm going to make you sick. So, that causes organisms to stay away from these animals. Here's another example, poison dart frog having the bright yellow and bright black. I'm toxic, don't touch me. If you do, you're going to, in a lot of cases, it's going to kill organisms. Now, that concept of warning coloration brings us to mimicry. Now, mimicry is where one species resembles another species that has a defense. And sometimes these can be one species that isn't dangerous, resembles another one that is. In the case here with these two butterflies, the one on the left being our monarch butterfly, the one on the right being a viceroy. They have the same coloration. They look very similar to one another. The monarch is actually poisonous and will make something sick, like the blue jay here, where the viceroy doesn't make something sick. So, in the example here, we can see that if a bird eats a monarch butterfly, it gets really sick and it learns to avoid the black and the orange coloration. So if it sees it again, it benefits all of them. So this attributes the fact that, you will see different organisms resembling or having the warning coloration, even if they're not dangerous. Here's mimicry with the black and yellow stripes. So these organisms here are flies and wasps, or flies and beetles, that all look like bees and wasps because they've got that yellow and black coloration, even though none of them are dangerous. Now, for some organisms, their best line of defense are deceptive looks. So these wing spots on this moth look a lot like large eyes. And for organisms, large eyes typically mean large organisms. So a bird that might want to try to eat this wasp would see these eyes and it would stay away because chances are it could be an even bigger bird that wants to eat the bird. So they will think that perhaps it would be a predator of itself. So the bird stays away from that moth. Here's another picture showing a moth with these large eye spots. Some caterpillars have some very cool defense mechanisms. This is a snake caterpillar that if it's touched or, feels threatened, it will inflate its one end, changing its shape to look like a snake head. So, for example, a bird that might want to eat the caterpillar would, disturb it, see what resembles a snake head. The snakes might eat the bird, so the bird would be scared of this caterpillar. Here's another caterpillar. This is a swallowtail caterpillar. Big eyes typically mean big organism, so stay away. Sometimes you get really deceptive on the looks. This is another caterpillar. And with its coloration and its shape, it is sort of camouflage and sort of deceptive looks because this is actually, even though it's a living caterpillar, it resembles bird droppings. So predators will stay away because they don't think it's food. We could see schooling behavior. So this is a behavioral mechanism for prey defense. And when you have a lot of fish that move together in the water, they create these large shadows. So it looks like a really big organism in the water. So predators tend to stay away. And even if a predator does come through here, this idea of flocking or schooling lessens your chance of being individualized and picked out from the crowd and eaten. So you're hanging out with a whole bunch of other fish with the hopes that you won't be selected to be eaten. If you're swimming by yourself, chances are you're going to be getting eaten. Social interaction can also take into account, communication for different organisms. So sometimes you'll see organisms that will, spot a predator and send out a call and warn the other animals and say, hey, somebody is coming, watch out, there's a predator. So there can be, different forms of communication within a particular population.